Hello, everyone. My name is Eric. I'm a limited licensed master social worker and psychotherapist, and I've been working with children, youth, and adults for the last 10 years. Today's episode of So, You Want to Learn Psychology? Picks up right where we left off at the end of episode 3 with Rollo May's classic work, Psychology and the Human Dilemma. I chose this book next in the series because of its roots in existential psychology and psychotherapy. If we want to get the best understanding of what existential psychotherapy is, we can look no further than Dr. Irvin Yalom's book, but essentially, existential psychotherapy sets out to deal with the constants of human existence. These are not the simple symptom clusters of diagnostic manuals, but the truly archetypal and deeply significant lifelong issues that everyone, regardless of their place in the world, their culture, or their time period, must essentially contend with. The four basic pillars of existential psychotherapy are meaning, which we covered in the previous episode, death, which will be the topic of a future episode, responsibility and authenticity, and isolation and anxiety. As we read through Psychology and the Human Dilemma, we notice that the red thread that runs through the book is existential anxiety, the anxiety that is produced by man feeling at odds with himself, or, in Rollo May's words, the human dilemma is that which arises out of a man's capacity to experience himself as both subject and object at the same time. In the dialectical process between these two poles lies the development, deepening, and widening of human consciousness. Now, although this quote doesn't necessarily state anxiety as the human dilemma, we can infer that the dialectical process between these two poles essentially creates anxiety as a byproduct of the dynamic function of psychic and libidinal energy that reverberates between the two poles in man. If we think about anxiety this way, we conclude that living a life without anxiety is a complete impossibility. One of Freud's biggest contributions to psychology, and a very little understood fact about the nature of mental illness, is that anxiety is at the root of every mental health condition. If you think about it, every mental illness has some element of anxiety inherent within it. Depression and anxiety are our most frequent diagnoses. Adjustment disorders come with or without anxiety. Social and separation anxieties, phobias, obsessive-compulsive disorders, and the like. There is anxiety in psychosis and in pre-psychosis, anxiety in PTSD and other trauma and stress-related disorders, and anxiety can even become its own personality disorder. The point is, to some degree, that every mental illness is an anxiety disorder. When we cannot process or cope with it effectively, it begins its transformation from a positive, motivating energy into a malignant and destructive feeling. We generally do things with positive, constructive anxiety, but when we don't sublimate it or transmute it into something else, to use alchemical language, it becomes corrosive. And as everyone who is familiar with the uneasy feeling of anxiety knows all too well, it can be one of the most, if not the most uncomfortable emotional state that a person can experience. Rollo May writes, to differentiate neurotic anxiety from normal anxiety is anxiety which is proportionate to the threat, does not involve repression, and can be confronted constructively on the conscious level, or can be relieved if the objective situation is altered. Neurotic anxiety, on the other hand, is a reaction which is disproportionate to the threat, involves repression and other forms of intrapsychic conflict, and is managed by various kinds of blocking off of activity and awareness. Actually, neurotic anxiety develops when a person has been unable to meet normal anxiety at the time of the actual crisis in his growth and threat to his values. Neurotic anxiety is the end result of previously unmet normal anxiety. So, to understand more about the nature of anxiety from an existential psychological perspective, we continue reading. Psychology and the Human Dilemma might as well have been titled Existential Anxiety, but the human dilemma, I'm sure, appeals to a much wider audience. A poignant reminder of the archetypal nature of the problem comes up in the next quote. Rollo May, in writing about existential anxiety and how it pervades our culture and existence as a people on Earth, writes in reference to the expanding possibility of thermonuclear war. The sad realization of the archetypal nature of these issues comes as we recognize that nothing really has changed from the 1960s until now, besides being 60 years in the future and the different types of bombs that we fear flying over our heads. He writes, "The impotence in the face of thermonuclear war moved into anxiety. Anxiety into regression and apathy, and these, in turn, into hostility. And the hostility into an alienation from man to man. Anxiety is generated in direct proportion to his conviction of his own impotence." We intuitively know that this description of the process of cultural change in man is true. We see it with our own eyes every day in the year 2025. It begins with the reduction of the sense of control over one's existence. When society invented a means of destroying human life from across borders and from overseas, the feeling of safety and control we once had was severely diminished. With this sense of safety gone, anxiety filled the void. For those who couldn't find a constructive outlet to sublimate their anxiety, it was reduced neurotically by means of regression, in terms of the shrinking down and shirking off of responsibilities of life, and apathy, another more detrimental emotional state where one feels nothing because it is preferable to feeling bad. Then, from apathy to hostility, which is more clear than ever in our culture. We no longer care to feel. So if we no longer feel, then the feeling, guilty or ashamed, won't hold us back from our personal quest to exert some control over our lives again, and damn whoever gets in our way. This end result is the alienation from man to man that May is talking about. In our current political and social climate, it is every man for himself. Everyone is weary of their neighbor. No one wants to get to know anyone anymore. We even use self-checkout lines at the grocery store. What were once minor inconveniences are enough to light our fuses now. We vote for further increased restrictions against people we do not know and do not wish to know. The hostility of our age is tangible and unmistakable. But the point of this series is not only to critique culture, to give historical timelines of psychological developments, or to ponder the implications of things that are beyond our control. The main purpose of these videos is to relate the educational material to working within ourselves and with others who ask for our help. We need to be able to put existential psychological theory into practice. So what can we do? The first thing we can do is fundamentally change our approach to the problem by seeing things a different way. May writes, "First, the problem of defining health, illness, and neurosis. In our field, we've been in the strange position of deducing our image of the normal, healthy man from sickness and neurosis. The people who don't break down don't come for help, and the problems of a kind which do not fit our techniques we tend not to perceive. Since we identify neurosis and many forms of psychosis only by virtue of the fact that the sufferers therefrom cannot fit into our society, and since we understand illness by virtue of our techniques, we are bound to end up with a view of man which is a mirror of our culture and techniques. This inevitably results in a progressively empty view of man. Health becomes the vacuum which is left when the so-called neurosis is cured. On the psychosis level, if a man can stay out of jail and support himself, we call this vacuum health. We start by coming to terms with the fact that what makes a person healthy or ill is not the presence or absence of anxiety. We have to accept the fact of life and nature that anxiety is archetypal, and from this fact we can deduce that the presence of neurotic anxiety inhibits our growth and taints our experience, but the presence of anxiety in our lives does not necessarily make us mentally ill, insane, or disordered. One of my clients, a man in his mid-30s with bipolar disorder and a schizotypal personality, originally came into treatment during a particularly manic period in his life. During the first 2 to 3 months of working with him, I could hardly get a word in during sessions. His pressured speech was fueled by anxiety, and his manic defenses against anxiety and depression caused him to move across the state, which quickly rendered effective treatment impossible. Soon after, he took off around the country, He was eventually hospitalized, and he was brought back to me to help pick up the pieces and start fresh with a dose of some antipsychotic medication to keep the mania at bay. With his manic defense from depression and anxiety pharmacologically controlled, he now has to sit with these uncomfortable feelings and decide what to do with them. I reassured him that the fact that he is now able to feel his anxiety and depression means that his prognosis is significantly improved. Bipolar disorder is one of the most dangerous mental health conditions because the completion rate of suicide or accidental death or injury during a manic episode is an extremely common occurrence. As James Hillman puts it, during a manic episode, the body becomes an instrument of action and therefore has the energy and intention that precedes suicide or other impulsive behaviors. It took my client a few moments to process that his life could be any better with these feelings of anxiety and depression, but the realization occurred to him after a bit of psychoeducation. You see, his manic defenses against anxiety and depression led him down a dangerous path of goal-driven behavior that turned his mind away from near constant emotional turmoil. With his manic defenses disengaged, he can now actually feel again, which is an overall objective improvement in psychological functioning. A clinically relevant sign of improvement in mental health is when a patient moves from apathy to depression. This signifies improvement in the ability to feel something rather than feel nothing. We talked about what that means going forward, that without relying on his manic defenses, it means addressing those sources of anxiety that he ran from for so long. Recognizing that anxiety is an unavoidable emotional state given much of the circumstances in life, and that to some degree anxiety can be healthy depending on if it's converted into positive motivation or change. He tells me that he doesn't feel like he's made any progress, though I assured him that his current episode of bipolar depression is severely skewing his ability to perceive things in a positive way. I told him, "You may not feel like you're doing better, but I can see how much you've improved." He smiled and said, "That's because I'm depressed." A simple but profound quote near the end of the book regarding our misguided relationship to anxiety reinforces how poorly our culture addresses the problem. This belief goes with the frantic, though illusory, hope that somehow we shall not have to face the devastating anxiety of the present world predicament if we can only find the right technique. The truth is, no technique will ever be found that will relieve us from anxiety, and for good reason. Anxiety has a biological basis and purpose, and so to live without it would be to live without one of our most potent stimulus to action. Anxiety is, as I see it, the true human dilemma. It is the shield that protects and the sword that cuts to our core. As Jung said, symptoms are symbols, and if we learn to understand anxiety as a symbol of transformation, we can meet the task of transmuting our anxiety into something greater, a creative endeavor, or a living, breathing courage to overcome the obstacles that stand in our way. This is existential anxiety, and it is no mere mental health condition. It is latent psychic energy, and what you choose to do with it is up to you. That concludes this week's episode of So, You Want to Learn Psychology? Next week's episode will be a bit of a surprise. I hope you tune in and enjoy. Until next time, thank you.